Hi, Steve Addison here for the Movements Podcast, the podcast for people who want to multiply disciples and churches everywhere. Today we're sitting around the kitchen table in Boogaholla, North Carolina, with Jeff and Angie Sundell, recently returned from their mission to Athens.
Several times we heard them say, God brought me here so that I could hear the story of Jesus. That was why I had to endure all this, and it was so worth it. There was this woman, she was actually a midwife in Iran, and she had started asking questions about Christianity. So she was not a believer at that point, but just the fact that she was curious and asking questions, the police started just asking her questions on why she was curious and actually shut her business down, so she couldn't see any patients. And then I'm not quite sure exactly how this happened, but they lost their house. Whether it was her lack of a job or whether it was a political move. So they lost her house, lost her business. And so her husband just said, we need to get out of here, because they were threatening to arrest her, although she was, like I said, not a believer yet. So they paid a lot of money to a smuggler, because they also had 2 children. And so the smuggler got all of them out, but took every bit of money that they had. It was over $20,000 that they could just get their hands on. And they made it to Turkey and then by boat to Greece. And there, of course, she started asking questions again of some people there that were working on, just tell me about Jesus. Who is he? Why did he have to die? What is all this that I keep hearing? And so one of the national leaders was able to share the gospel with her, and she was just primed and just ready to believe. Her husband also believed, as did their oldest son. Their other son is a little bit young yet, but while we were there, actually visiting this particular area, all 3 of them were baptized while we were there. So that was really neat to hear their story, but yet see that culmination. And that is when they had said, this is all worth it. Losing our house, losing our money, because they don't have anything except the clothes that they could carry with them to come over. So they have no possessions whatsoever, no money. But they said, this is worth it. This is why God brought us out, because we wouldn't have heard otherwise.
Where were they from?
Iran.
That day that they had come to faith and where they were baptized, when he was baptized, I remember him, just raising his arms to the air and celebrating. But then he baptized his wife, and that night there were 6 or 7 people baptized, but we went back to have a little just celebration meal with some Greek pizza, I guess you'd call it, and Coke, Coca-Cola and stuff. And so we're sitting around, and all of them, the interesting thing is all of them will say, hey, it was bad where we came from, but the conditions we're in now are horrific. In this particular island, it's overcrowded, and a lot of struggles between different factions inside the camps. And so they were sitting around sharing, and one of the men shared that he said, as they were just finishing up pizza, we'd sang a worship song, had taken a little time to pray. And this one man said, you now are my family. And he was pointing around to the other families there, single guys and this one small family. And he said, "You are my family." And then they just started spontaneously sharing testimonies of how this was their new family. And then the interesting thing is then they said, "We want to meet together every day and learn more about the Bible. And we want to study and learn more about who Jesus is." And we can see now it was hard where we were at. And actually where we're at now is very hard, if not harder, where we're at. But we want to learn more about Christ and how to walk with Christ. And one of those, the one man who, the interesting thing is we didn't say that was a church at that particular time. I was sitting there going, man, we got to do the Lord's Supper and call this as a church, but we didn't do that. But I mean, essentially they took the form of a church, because they're saying, if you look at the different things inside a church of how you describe a church, it's about family. And it's structured, the whole picture is about the family of God. And so here's this picture of the family of God emerging literally moments after coming out of the waters of the sea in baptism. And so they're, since then, one of these gentlemen has led several other people to Christ, and so this is just in a few short months, they're already beginning to, and early on I remember the leader was a little discouraged because he's like, man, they're not sharing the gospel right, they don't have it all right. But you know what, they were sharing, and then you keep working on it and coaching them. They're essentially doing some model assist, lead with him and modeling for him and assisting him how to do it. But since then, this gentleman actually has led several people to Christ and baptized them. Wow. And that happened in the last couple of weeks. So it was pretty amazing to hear how the suffering, in spite of all the suffering, and I listen to you listen to stuff they go through, and you're just like, I have no idea how they could endure that. And then on the other side, they're looking at, but it was all worth it to come to know Christ. So, they're working on, as they're discipling, putting in the mind, you're leaving here as a church planter. You're leaving here to go share the gospel. You're leaving here to go make disciples. And you're not going to go and just disappear. You're going to go and literally plant a church. And then a number of the leaders working on developing systems to do almost like Skypleship or Zoomaship, where they're using online type things after these folks leave, that they can literally follow up with them and continue to disciple them and begin crisscrossing in Europe and training and equipping them to plant churches. So that's literally happening. The other exciting thing is some of them, the leaders there, are casting vision to them to possibly go back to their own countries and go back to share the gospel, make disciples, and plant churches. And we can't say where they've gone to, but there's actually a number of examples now. People chose to go back, and they went back feeling called to go back to their country and to reach their family and friends and neighbors. And so it's really exciting. So it's not only is it going into Europe and potentially what God's doing there and the future churches that'll come out of that and the multiplying disciples that come out of that, but it's also funneling back into the Middle East and North Africa, which the exciting thing is, what if more and more of that becomes the norm of what God could continue to do through that, which he's already, how he's using. That's one of those difficult things of understanding with the suffering and the difficulty, but yet in the midst of that, how God is using that in amazing ways through his grace, through these people's lives, that it's hard for us to comprehend the suffering and difficulty they've been through, but yet seeing the joy that a number of them have embraced this calling and said, man, I am called to reach my nation, to reach my people. And, one of the things that, and I know you guys have experienced this, is the discouragement when you reach a Western European and then you try and, or even a pre-existing Christian, to get them broken for lostness and to try and get them to start praying for their friends, and they're willing to do that. But then the willingness to share. But man, it would never, when we would ask, how can we pray? And pray for my family. And you see the brokenness immediately for their family and how desperately they wanted their family back in their country to hear the gospel of Jesus Christ. And you can't man, when that is already existing in somebody's heart, it's so amazing how God can use that, because that's what reminds me of South Asia, is that's what happened. As soon as somebody came into the kingdom, there was this hunger to immediately go back and share the gospel. And so we saw that over and over again, which was really encouraging, because you can have great methods and tools, but you can't create that heart. That heart is something God already put in there. So it was really exciting to see that in the men and women's hearts, for sure. I think one of the brothers, again, can't share his name, but he said over and over again, he said, we hear so much negative about what's happening, say, in Europe because of Islam or whatever. And he said, I want you to tell everybody in the West, and you tell the Christians, there's good things happening, that God's moving. And so I think one is that's the overall message, is God is using this moment. And, so it's really interesting when you look at, sort of the bedrock of the early church planting of the first century after Christ, that incredible move of God then. And you literally have the people traveling here and there to plant the church. Well, now you have literally people being brought in to literally hear the gospel of Jesus Christ, be discipled, and become a church planter, and then spun out all over. So it's almost like a reversal of what you see in the book of Acts, but yet God's using the same region to literally spread the gospel all over. I mean, if you were to go from literally that Jerusalem to Illyricum, and you go all the way down to into Africa, and then swing all the way up into Europe, and there's no place in that area that is not being affected by this. And so, there's a negative narrative of what some of the things that have happened, but there's this incredible narrative that God is painting of people coming into the kingdom and crisscrossing the globe and becoming future gospelers, disciplers, and church planters. And so it's, it's a unique opportunity, because you don't know how much longer it will last. It slows down at times and speeds up, but it is an opportunity. So I think one is having the right mindset. So let's stop looking at it as all negative. And part of it is the Great Commission. We're told to go and make disciples, and we're told to go and get involved in that, not live in fear and being paralyzed. And so I think, it's just an incredible opportunity. And I know we've been sort of biding our time for the last couple years here in the U.S., and just our season where we were at, and watching this situation, and really didn't have any plans of being involved in this. We planned to sort of go back to Asia, and then we felt very clearly last year we were watching a video called Lucify, which was showing all of the refugees flooding into North Africa, from North Africa and Middle East into Europe. And God just really put it on our heart that we were to be involved, and we thought, man, that's not really what we had planned, what we wanted to do. Sorry, it's just like Europe's not like my favorite place to go in the world. I love Asia. I love the third world. And, but just that sense of God said, hey, I want you to go. And what God put on our heart was to train and equip 1,000 leaders, not for going into Europe from this area, but actually to go back into North Africa, Middle East. And so, and we felt very, on a personal level, this has nothing to do with anybody else, but we felt very affirmed in that, one, from some of the national brothers and sisters we met, as far as an affirmation of that's what we're supposed to do on a personal level. But on another side, just we felt really a release that this is what we're supposed to do for the next season of our life. And I know that's not for everybody, but it's just it does look like there's for the foreseeable future, there's a season right now where we have a place that's open, that we can share the gospel. We have a place that's open. We can disciple. We can equip people to plant churches. We can practice and be church in these places in Europe. But what if there's something that triggers a number of these folks going back into North Africa, Middle East? Will we be ready? Will we have people in place, trained, equipped, that they could go back to their homelands and know how to share the gospel? They could get involved in disciple. They could be planting churches back in their homelands. And so we're trusting and believing that that's somewhere in the next coming season. as it continues to flood this way, but we feel like somewhere down the road there is going to be a push back the other direction. And like I said earlier, we're already seeing some examples of that happen. But what if something caused a greater push, and I don't know what that is. But we've gone to bed a couple nights and went to bed under a king and woke up the next day and the king and his family's gone, and went to bed one night, it was a democracy, and woke up the other night and it was a communist regime in a country. So God can change things instantly, and so who knows what's going to happen. But we just really feel like God's we need to be in this season focusing in on here, raising up leaders with the focus of North Africa and Middle East. Definitely, I think the big key piece of this is really the national brothers and sisters, as always. Whether it's Asia or anywhere you go in the world, the key is those. Now, the interesting thing in this case is it's sort of reversed, because these are people who are not from the local country being forced into that country, but it's their people. So yeah, there's definitely a hunt there, whether you find somebody who's a pre-existing believer or somebody who came to Christ on the way, or somebody who comes to Christ there, and then essentially, equipping and bringing focus to that to get them back and focusing on their people, whether here, Europe, or back in their homelands. So, I can't say any people I know in the U.S., as far as the guys I work closely with, ever said, hey, let's go out and start a hub strategy. It was more of, we ran into some folks in L.A. Who were more or less doing like a residency type thing to train, equip people to go overseas. And just through doing some training with them and equipping, this was Troy actually, who was out there, and some others, and just sort of got turned on to the idea of, hey, these residencies could be really helpful. Now, we were thinking residencies so we can reach American cities, and so began to do that. And what we found is there was something powerful about somebody committing to be part of like a residency for a season and digging in for a year and just saying, man, I'm going to get trained, equipped, I'm going to put X amount of time in a harvest, and it's literally they're literally signing their life to say, this is what I'm going to go do for a season, and then doing it with some friends and doing it as a team. And so we've seen, residencies multiply. So I'd love to say it was somebody's grand scheme or idea or strategy. I think it was more of, hey, here's what God was already doing, and you see what He's doing, and then you're tweaking as you're going, and you're learning as you're going on the way, and then in the midst of that, it's just there becomes a natural hunger that people want to. Not all people are called to the U.S. Some are called overseas, and some are called to other cities in the U.S. or in North America, whatever it may be. And so that naturally led, and there was already this idea put out by, I think Steve Smith and Stan Parks had maybe written an article on the hubs. I think it was Steve and Stan, and this idea. And but the big thing in the U.S. is, man, we really wanted to keep, with no place left, we wanted to keep focused on multiplying disciples, multiplying churches. We're not here for the sake of mobilization, but the outcome of multiplying disciples and multiplying churches should be mobilization, locally and globally. And so through the midst of that, so we've just been determined that we will not be mobilization movement. We will be movement to mobilization. So we will keep the focus locally, that it is the idea of we can't cause movement, but we can share the gospel, make disciples, pray, be out loving our neighbors, and do those basic things of the faith, and then leave the results up to God. That's in His sovereignty and His hand. But in the midst of that, He's allowing some places to see some multiplication of churches. And out of that, though, there's people being mobilized. And now the idea is then mobilize them into a hub where, so they leave equipped, and at least equipped to a certain level, much more than I was equipped. When I left and went overseas, I think I had to have won somebody to Christ in the previous year was my requirement, and then some seminary classes, and that was all good, but I didn't know how to make a disciple. I'd never been involved in church planting. I never helped figure out, how do you find a leader out of the harvest? How do you disciple a leader? How do you train, equip leaders? How do you train churches? Never done any of that. Well, now you're talking about sending people, and then you're actually not going to necessarily cut them loose. You're actually going to send them into a hub where they can now learn to work with national partners who are already seeing some level of multiplication. And so if you take a place like Athens where there is discipleship multiplication and some church multiplication going on, and you can have somebody come in and learn on the job. And you can learn on the job, how do you learn some language? How do you team together and not kill each other? So how do you team together and have healthy teams? How do you have healthy rhythms? And so one of the things we got to do this summer that was fun is we got to work with a small team there, work with a team in Athens and some of the nationals and the expats and a team from the outside who all came out of residencies, all leading hubs. And we just got to essentially spend a season practicing a rhythm together. So how do you be church together? How do you do Matthew 18 together and stay healthy? How do you pray together? How do you fast and pray together? How do you train together? How do you work together? How do you keep the momentum going? And at the same time, how do you solve problems together? How do you have healthy relationships with nationals? So I think that's going to be the exciting thing about these hubs is instead of we can actually have people coach somebody into how do you have a healthy relationship with a national? And how do you not blow that out? How do you honor that relationship? How do you honor the team? And and we know in the idea with teams, the tendency is lean and mean. So we're talking about 2 to 3 units in a hub being the core who might receive 2 to 3 units, train them for a season, and then the idea is then spin them to a new place. So for example, we can see in Athens of spinning a hub out after they have a season in Athens of learning and being equipped, spin them out to one of these islands. And that could be a focus for a hub, or could be spinning them out into another place like Italy or Spain where they're receiving a number of the refugees and establish a hub. But they actually had practical experience in the U.S., practical experience here. Then the other really cool thing is you're seeing disciples multiply out of Athens is what if you follow the relationship? Or what if some of those guys, once they get some paperwork, end up in some of those receiving places and become the bedrock and the core of that local team? So you have, when I say that, I'm talking about an Arabic speaker or a Persian speaker or Urdu speaker, and they're the front lines down in Spain and Italy of the work in the hub, and they're the core of that team also. So it's not just only talking about mobilizing Western Europeans. We're talking about it's also mobilizing and being intentional with what God's already doing through the multiplication of following those relationships and then building around those relationships to continue multiplying disciples and multiplying churches.
So hubs into Europe, but also hubs back into the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia.
Yeah, essentially, again, just looking at following relationships, and and what I mean by that is if some folks come to Christ and get discipled and have a desire to go back to their country, and it makes sense, from a security standpoint, if it just makes sense that you'd want to do that, then essentially could be establishing some type of a hub, or it might be an all-national hub of folks from that country together working in that hub, working with other more arm's length people groups in that type of hub. And so that would be part of that. But again, it's really more just about following relationship and being intentional to keep building momentum around the relationships, but also around what God is doing and having those right tools and methods. So sort of common tools, common language, common process, because we think that's one of the things that could be really helpful when we think about coalition into Europe and we think about hubs along the Mediterranean or other areas, is if we have common language, common tools, common processes, it'll make it much easier to hand relationships off and build hubs out and then build out coalition, say into Europe. You don't necessarily have to build hubs all the way up into Europe, but you can build coalition through existing relationships that are already there if you had the common language, common tools, common processes, and just had that level of trust. And so that's just feel like that's going to be one of the key pieces of this whole just just the whole piece of what God's doing. And there's lots of people trying this lots of different ways, and we're just one of the others, giving it a go just because we see God moving and excited to partner with, what others and what God's doing in the midst of that.
So the community, just God's community, wherever you go, just amazes me. But even in Athens, seeing these national leaders who are from these various countries across the Middle East and North Africa, even countries that are warring against each other, but they have a love for each other that is amazing. I mean, it's that love that Jesus talked about. They will know, the world will know that you're my disciples because of your love for one another. And I think this is the first time that I've really seen that love and how it supersedes what governments are doing and the wars that are going on. There's a love and a camaraderie among these guys that is just a blessing. I mean, they pray for each other whenever one of them has a baptism or someone comes to Christ or something has happened. All the other ones just pipe in, that is great, I'm so happy, praise the Lord is using you. And they're just such an encouragement to each other.
But we actually spent almost a month observing this time. So in the circumstances were right. Most of the time you can't do that. But we literally just observed for a month. We just followed the guys around and watched. And so it was really amazing what you could learn sheerly through observation, because the reality is in this setting that we're talking about, there is no good language, and I know as missiologists, your language and culture is real important. And, Urdu, I can follow 60% maybe, and we can talk a little bit, but for the most part, it was pure observation. But it was really, I'll give you an example. One night we watched some seekers being trained by a 6-month-old believer who had a 2-year-old believer who was assisting him, and then a 9-year-old believer who was watching him. Well, that is awesome, because they're doing model, assist, watch, and leave. And we actually saw that in numerous places. So that was one of those really, observations you looked at and you go, wow, that's amazing. That you're doing a good job on that. We also observed that, when we're thinking about reproduction, we want simple biblical reproducing. What we saw was extremely, biblical and very solid training materials. And it was probably a little too much. And so the challenge then was to talk to our brothers and just go, man, your material is spot on. And you're doing such an awesome job with model, assist, watch, and leave. And man, if you could maybe give a little less content, not so much volume, because the volume sometimes is too much. Reduce the volume of content. And then what if we could practice it a little bit, And so that was one of the little tweaks we did. So you observed a really amazing thing. You picked up on something here and you said, wow, if we could tweak this and make it a little simpler, you got it solid biblically, and then find a way to practice it. And then let's hammer and work on that 3/3 piece. And by the end, the guys were making that course correction, which is going to actually, sometimes we think, hey, if I give everybody all the information, all the volume of my knowledge, that somehow they're going to be a better disciple. Well, it could be actually you're giving them too much, and what they need instead is a little piece, and practice it in a little piece, and practice it in a little piece, and practice it in a little piece, and practice it. That's the way it was in sports for me. That's the way it's been in a lot of areas. As my background's sort of a mechanic a long time ago. It was learn a little, practice it, learn a little, practice it, learn a little. It wasn't getting it all at once. And so I think reducing volume, but solid biblical, simple. And then if you can get to the reproduction by adding the practice piece in. And so it was really amazing, by the end of the observation, we're watching them. So I was never getting up there teaching lessons or hey, translate. It was just observation. By the end, you're seeing them really follow a tight 3/3, and then you're seeing them take the material they love and they designed and they worked on it, but yet they want their disciples to be healthy, and realizing that sometimes the volume's creating confusion. Make it a little simpler, get them practicing it. You can still eventually cover the same amount of stuff. You just stretch it out a little bit. And so it was really exciting to see those little tiny tweaks, which will make big differences. And then one of the other really fun things we had that was a big learning thing is we only talked about grandchildren. So we just constantly talked about grandchildren. So a lot of time we'd say second or third generation. But we just tell me, Ali, Muhammad, any of the men's names that, we can't use, but we just say, hey, tell me about your grandchildren. And so how many times are your grandchildren sharing the gospel? How is your grandchild doing at discipling somebody? What are the activities your grandchildren are doing? And it was amazing when you threw that little shift. And so we remember, the first week we came back to meet with one of the teams, and there were 5 different teams doing this. And one of the teams came back and so how many gospel shares did the grandchildren get? And I want to say it was 3. And how many people came to Christ? They had somebody come to Christ, but they had one grandchild baptism that week. And all right, well, now tell me about the children. And so we began to talk about the children. And they had 15 gospel shares that week, and I think they had maybe 4 baptisms of children that week. And so that's great. Well, what they did the week before is they spent all their time equipping the children how to share the gospel. Now, they'd already equipped them, but they went back and strengthened them. Well, that resulted immediately in a few more of them. Well, what then did the children do? The children strengthened the grandchildren, which led to 1 baptism. Well, now we meet the second week. So the second week, this particular same group, if we're walking you through it, they how'd the grandchildren do this week? And so they shared that week. There were 7, 8 gospel shares of the grandchildren and 3 baptisms. And the children had 30 plus gospel shares and 7 or 8 baptisms. And so we told them, we said, we don't want to hear about you. So the leaders were not allowed to report how many times they shared the gospel. They weren't allowed to report how much they discipled. They were only focusing on the children. Well, if you're asking your child about the grandchild, what will the child ask about for his grandchild? He's going to ask his child about the grandchild, which immediately forced a lot more discipleship. And so by right after we left, actually, I think we were still in Europe. We were in Czech Republic. We got word that there was a great-grandchild baptism, or baptizer, I should say. And so it was just exciting for me. My big takeaway, and I picked this up from watching Ryan Alberson, was the power of observation. That you can learn a lot. Actually, if you watch the process and you watch what people are doing, you can pick up. Now it's really helpful to have the language, obviously. But in a place like right now, what happens to be going on in Europe, there is no good language. It's the truth. And learn one for sure, but you're not going to learn them all, But you can learn a lot through observation and just watching, and then help bring the obstacle to light, and then work with, instead of imposing, work with them to figure out solutions so they own the solutions. So that was a big, it really made me think, strategically on some things in the future of how we might do some things differently when it comes to more of a problem-solving approach versus, because a lot of times you just go in, hey, I got 4 days, I'm going to wing it, throw something, see what sticks on the wall, and that's sometimes what you have to do when you're in a setting where you don't understand. But man, the power of observation on the front side was really a very helpful piece for this, and something you need to really think through about in the future of how could you work and help teams or hubs in the future in problem solving. And this might be a piece of it, is that.
We actually had a mid-level with some of these national brothers, and in that mid-level went through Acts and Corinthians, since we were close to Corinth. And that was one thing that came out is, okay, this is where Paul started, in this exact same region. And he was able to say, well, there's no place left. I'm going on to Spain, which at that time was the ends of the earth. And that we are poised right back in the same area, but watching God bring people in that are then going back out to these same areas and affecting that same region. So that was really interesting to draw a parallel between 2,000 years ago and today and what God is doing in that area.
And a fun little story was we were with Austin Stone, a few guys from Austin Stone, and a guy named Joey. And so Joey, we're up on Mars Hill, because you can't help but go to Mars Hill. And so we were doing an iron. And so Angie was leading our study, and we were looking at Acts versus Corinth. And so she's leading the study, so she asked somebody to read. Well, Joey decides as loud as he can on Mars Hill in the evening. It's packed full of people. He reads Paul's sermon as loud as he can. And you hear a few people going, amen. There was, some Koreans over here. And then there was, and some people came up. And one of the funny things is one guy came up and it was almost, in the end, we literally had an Epicurean and we had a Stoic. So we had a man who was an atheist who'd been through the war in Croatia and had a lot of scars and a lot of hurts. I mean, physical scars, but also just emotional scars. And just so we ended up, talking with him and sharing the gospel. And he kept bantering. And there was a Muslim man also that there was a conversation going on there on a separate thing. And I remember we were standing there, and I'm just sort of out of ideas, because this guy's just, been through crazy experiences as we're sharing the gospel with him. And Lindsay just said, hey, can I pray for you? And he said, pray if you want. There's no God. He's not going to hear you. But she just started to pray, and tears came, and she's praying for him. And you could just, in the end, he said, thank you for the prayers. He said, I don't believe, and he said, I wish I could. I don't know how to, but thank you. And it was amazing that point in time how a mom's heart and her prayer literally, reaching out to God just touched this man's heart who really came up to debate there on Mars Hill, just like you would have seen in Acts 17. And so we ended up having two gospel shares there in the midst of our iron on iron, and one's an Epicurean and one's a Stoic. And so it was just fascinating when you looked around there on Mars Hill of all the different people from all the different places around the world. And I don't mean just the tourists. I mean literally a lot of these were the refugees who were there in this community. And then we went to, in the midst of this training, just a unique opportunity. If you're in Athens, we're doing our training. And so we decided to actually do our mid-level retreat in Corinth. And so we spend the day in Corinth, and we've read 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and we've read through Acts 17 and 18 in depth, and just been studying the Word for 3 days. And one of the brothers came up, and he just recently had been to where you can put one foot in France and 1 foot in Germany and 1 foot in Switzerland, maybe. Is that right? Is that Basel, I think? So he's there right on the river, and he's just sensing from God that, man, this is the time, this is the place to reach his people. And just his love and passion for the people from the Middle East. And so he's sharing this after he's gone through this study in the Word, and he's just going, this is the place. We're going to do it. This is the place that I'm committed to. And he's just adamant. And just, it was it was just like the Spirit of God came over him that moment, and you just had this sense of, you knew this guy's in the right place, the right time, and God's called him to reach his people, the Arabic speakers in this place. And so it was a really amazing moment just to think of, man, here's where it started, and God's using this in a whole different way now in this point in time in history.